Hello and welcome to this webinar. This webinar is all around the techniques that you need to use to pass the Functional Skills Level 2 Writing Exam. This is one of a series of webinars all around the writing exams. This is probably the one to watch first, and then you can go on and look at some of the more specific webinars that look at the different types of text you may write, such as letter writing and article writing. So I'm going to take you through some of the things that you need to know about the writing exam. So we'll start off our objectives. We're going to look at some of the criteria for the exam and the structure of it. We're going to very briefly talk about the document styles. As I said, there are some more specific webinars that go through exactly what you need to do for each document type. We're going to have a look at the marking scheme. So that will show you what you actually need to do to pass. As we go along, we'll talk about some of the reasons people lose marks. So hopefully you won't do those mistakes. And we'll think about how you can maximise the marks that you'll get. The writing exam is quite straightforward. So I would say if you're used to writing in a fairly formal way anyway, you shouldn't have too much difficulty. The main problems people have is when they start to get a little bit carried away with what they're doing. So if we look at the structure of the exam, they will always ask you two questions. So you'll always have to write two different documents. They both have equal marks, so you get 15 marks for question 1 and 15 marks for question 2, and you have 60 minutes in total. So those of you that have done the maths can probably work out you want to spend around 30 minutes on each of the questions, or perhaps 25 on each, leaving a bit of time at the end for checking back through them both. The main thing really to say there is do make sure that you are spreading your time equally between the two questions. If you only spend time on one question, obviously you're not going to be able to pass. You can use a dictionary, and I suggest that you do use one. You might want to just check where you're taking your exam, whether they have dictionaries available or whether you will need to just take your own in that you can perhaps borrow from somebody. The pass mark, it does change. It's not always the same. Roughly 18 marks out of the possible 30 will be a pass. Sometimes it's a little higher, sometimes a bit lower, but that is the average pass mark. So that just obviously shows that you can't pass just by getting 15 on question 1 and not attempting question 2. So the mark scheme is set up specifically for that reason. So we'll have a look. These are the different types of documents that you could be asked to write in the exam. A letter, an article, an email, a review, a speech, or a report. You will always have to write two different documents, so you won't get two letters or two emails. And you will be told, obviously, which ones you need to do. You don't get to choose yourself, so don't plan on, I'm definitely going to do articles and letters. You don't get a choice. They will tell you what to do. And obviously, you have to stick to that document type. Hard to say which ones come up most frequently. I say probably report is less likely. It could be any combination, so it could be a letter and an email, it could be an article and a speech. There isn't really any set pattern, so it's quite hard to predict. If you go back through all of the practice writing test papers, you'll be able to find an example of each one of these. You can have a practice at them all if you wish to, and just see what the style is like. Again, when we do the webinars that are on the specific document types, you will see the examples from Edexcel, and you'll see some sample answers as well that you could use to get the most marks. So the structure of those different text types, each one will have its own structure and layout that you should use on the test. And again, the webinars on each type will give you more information on that. Just to very briefly, I'll tell you what they're looking for. In a letter, they'll be looking for the two addresses, the date, the dear, and the correct ending of either yours sincerely or yours faithfully. So that's the one with the most structural features. On an article, they'll just be looking for a heading and possibly subheading. For an email, they'll be looking for the hi or the dear or the hello. The correct close, so not sincerely or faithfully, possibly regards or something similar. And they may, depending upon how the exam's set out, look for you to fill in the email addresses and subject, and sometimes those are done for you. In a review, the only real feature is some kind of title, And in a report, it's very similar to an article, heading and subheadings. In a speech, they're looking for the welcome for the audience and then the finish at the end, the thank you to the audience. Whatever you're writing, whether it's an article, a speech, a letter, an email, every single thing needs to have an introduction, a middle, and a conclusion. So always go back when you finish and check that those 3 criteria are covered. Particularly the conclusion is often the bit that people miss out. And I would always just try and make it really obvious for the examiners. So show you're writing a conclusion by using words like overall, in conclusion, in summary. And that it just helps them to tick off the marks on the mark scheme when you're leading them through your piece like that. Let's have a look at the mark scheme. The mark scheme is pretty set. It doesn't really vary between the different exam papers, so you always know what to expect. You can get up to 9 marks for form, communication and purpose, and I'll show you what that refers to in a moment, and up to 6 marks for what we call SPAG, which some of you will know stands for spelling, punctuation and grammar. So you do the maths again, that adds up to the 15 possible marks for each question. So each question follows this marking format. So if we look at the top box, so to get between 7 and 9 marks, you need to present appropriate information and develop your ideas logically for most of the response. So obviously, depending on whether you get the 7 or 9 will depend on how far you've done that. Are you able to present complex ideas and information clearly and concisely with occasional lapses? Can you use your language for specific purpose? Can you use a range of sentence structures accurately? And have you made consistent use of appropriate paragraphing and other organisational features with accuracy? So again, the difficulty there is that each one of those is fairly restrictive. So it doesn't give that much guidelines to the examiner on which box to put you in. So if you do some of those things very well, but in some of those things only hit the box 1, so basic ability to present complex ideas, then it makes it a lot harder for them to put the marks in, and you'll end up with probably a slightly lower mark. So if we have a kind of go into those in a bit more detail, presents appropriate information and develops ideas logically for most of the response. So appropriate means it actually fits what the question was asking you for. So sometimes people, especially in the exam pressure, they read the question and they slightly misunderstand what it's asking for, and they go off at a bit of a tangent, and the actual information they include isn't really suitable for that question. The second part, developing your ideas logically. And this is really the difference, I suppose, between the level 1 and level 2. Because at level 2, they're looking for you to develop those ideas. So not just to reword what's there, what's given to you in the prompt, if you like. Because often there's a bit of a lengthy prompt. It might be an existing email and you've got to reply to it. Or here's some information, use this to create an article. And you're developing those ideas. So you're not just taking what's there, you're adding to them. And one of the things people always worry about is they say, well, I can't make anything up that's not there. But actually that they are looking for you to develop. So they're looking for you to add in information that's relevant and useful. And it's fine to make it up so long as it's sensible. So the next bullet point was able to present complex ideas and information clearly and concisely. So clearly means that when the examiner's reading it, they can actually understand it. Concisely means that you're not rambling on and on and on for pages and pages. One of the things the examiner reports say, and you can look at those reports yourself, they're on the Edexcel website, is that sometimes people write far too much for these questions. And what the examiner says is that isn't really very functional, because in real life, if you wrote a 5-page letter to someone that could have been done in 1 page, it isn't particularly functional for real life. And again, it's complex ideas and information. So it's not just, again, stating what's there, adding your own bits to it. And the next one is uses language for a specific purpose throughout the response. Now, those that have already looked at the reading exam will know about different purposes of text. So to inform, to persuade, to describe, to instruct, all those different purposes. So often in the piece, they might ask you to be persuasive perhaps, or to explain something. So they're looking for you to actually use those techniques that you'll have been studying in your piece. So if you're supposed to be persuasive, are you using persuasive language? And that's what they'll be looking for to hit that higher band criteria. It uses a range of sentence structures accurately. So you may know that there's 3 types of sentence: your simple, your compound, and your complex. They'll be looking for you to use all 3 of those at level 2. At level 1, they'll only be looking for simple and compound. But at level 2, they're expecting to be able to use complex sentences. Now, that doesn't mean very, very long sentences. That means sentences that have a main clause and a subordinate clause. And we'll look at, probably see a couple of examples of those on the, as you go into each of the specific webinars, you'll see where some of the complex sentences are written. But just bear in mind, I think a lot of people tend to do this naturally, right, with different sentences. I would go back, just look at some of your writing, just see whether you can identify what kind of sentences you use. Are they all very, very long, complicated? Are they all very short? Or are they a nice mixture of everything? Then have a look at consistent use of appropriate paragraphing and other organisational features with accuracy. So we talked about some of the organisational features in terms of things like subheadings, headings, maybe even bullet points where it's appropriate. So those would be the organisational features. Paragraphing is really key. If you're not using paragraphing, you're dropping yourself into those lower bands. Particularly for emails, for some reason people often think that it's not relevant to use paragraphs because they're only writing one bit of information. Every single text you write should have paragraphs. I'd always aim for at least 3. Obviously, that will vary depending on what you're writing and how much, but 3 is always a good basic standard. So do make sure that you're paragraphing and leave a line between paragraphs so it's really clear for the examiner. So now we come on to the SPAG marks. And you can see that SPAG is marked out for a maximum of 6 points. To get the 6, you need to use spelling and grammar mostly accurately and supporting the meaning with your grammar. So you're not confusing the meaning by using words that aren't grammatically correct or spellings that are so confusing you can't understand it. Uses a range of punctuation, such as commas, apostrophes, and inverted commas correctly and appropriately most of the time. Now that's always a bit tricky. The Edexcel asking can be a bit tricky here because most of the time is quite open to interpretation. So for some examiners that might be 4 mistakes and then that's too many. For others it could be 8 mistakes. And this will depend probably on the length of your piece. So if you've written a longer piece but made more mistakes, then that would be more acceptable than a short piece with a lot of mistakes. As you can see, for the 3 to 4 marks, uses spelling and grammar with some accuracy, supporting meaning some of the time, and some punctuation, such as commas, apostrophes, inverted commas, correctly and appropriately. So what they're looking for there is the higher level punctuation. And I'll come back to that. So mostly accurate, supporting meaning most of the time. So you're looking for your spelling, and they're looking here at level 2 words as well as more basic words. So at level 1 and below, they wouldn't necessarily judge you if you tried to use a very complex word, whereas at level 2, because also you have access to the dictionary, they're really expecting you to be, on top of the spelling, checking it, getting it accurate. my general advice would be to, if you're not sure about a word, write it in at first, keep going, and then go back at the end and use your dictionary to check things. Because what you don't want to do is disrupt your flow of ideas by constantly checking things in the dictionary. So maybe use a pencil to highlight your word, go back at the end and check it. Range of punctuation, I've mentioned there commas, and they'll be looking for the level 2 standard of commas, not just commas and lists. Possessive apostrophes they'll be looking for, and inverted commas. I think that one's quite difficult to use in most texts. Probably articles would be the one I think you could use it in more. So a hint for spelling, I would say try and include some more, words that are a level 2 standard. Don't just stick to simple words. Proofread carefully, whether you're writing or typing, particularly typing, because we do make quite a few typing errors as we're going. And I find that this loses people the most marks. It's not actually they can't spell the word, they've just typed it wrong. Particularly because you don't get the autocorrect if you're doing the online exam on the platform. And we're used to the autocorrect doing capitals for us, checking typing errors. So you need to really do that yourself. Underneath here, you can see some of the most commonly misspelt words that I see on exams all the time. Writing, would you believe, is one of the most common ones. A lot of people putting 2 T's in it. So if you are one of those people, just make a note now that writing is only spelt with 1 T. Believe, for some reason, comes up a lot on that list. I think it's because you can hear the E sound. People put the E before the I. I don't know why thank you is one of those. I think it's because it tends to be the last thing people write and they rush it, and then I put thank you. My pet hates a lot. One, writing a lot isn't the best use of English, especially at level 2. You ought to be able to think of a slightly more sophisticated word. The second is that a lot of people write it as one word, so A-L-O-T. That actually is not a real word. That does not exist in the dictionary. So if you are going to write a lot, make sure you write it as 2 separate words. As well, I'm not sure why that's commonly misspelt. This is something that the Edexcel examiners have highlighted. I think maybe it's people maybe squishing the 2 words together. Manager also sometimes comes up. I think people not reading it correctly and perhaps writing manger. And receive, because it's one of those rules that fits the I before E except after C, and a lot of people forget that. And the other ones that I notice a lot, sincerely, very few people get that right the first time. So if you don't know how to spell sincerely, I would definitely practice it, because if you get a letter, there's a good chance you'll need to use that word. And then, as I said, use that dictionary. It's there, you've got it. Look it up the words at the end, because that makes best use of your time. So basic punctuation. So at level 2, they're expecting you to be able to use basic punctuation anyway. So basic punctuation is what we call capital letters, full stops, and question marks. With capital letters, the 2 ways you can lose marks. One is completely missing them out. So because, again, as I mentioned, auto typing, we used to Word in our emails putting those capitals in for us, so people just forget that they need them at the start of their sentences for people's names and places. So that's better than the proofreading you can check. The other way, so it's either not using them enough or overusing them. So giving what are common nouns proper noun status by giving them a capital letter. So instead of writing hospital with a small h, people would write, we went to the hospital. I attend the local college, rather than just college. You only need to put the capitals in those words when you're giving the specific place name. So if you went to St Anne's Hospital, then you would use the capital letters there. If you attend Manchester College, and that's its name, then you'll have the capital for M and the capitals for C, because that's a specific individual name. So if you're not sure with capitals, I always say, ask yourself, is it a specific individual name? If not, it probably doesn't need one. The other thing with the exam software, as I mentioned, if you are doing it online, is I. So small I, capital I. Do make sure it's doing that capital one for you, or you're actually putting that in. It won't do it automatically, so you'll need to remember to check your I's. I've noticed some people do a small I when they're handwriting as well, so just watch out for that if you're one of those people, because that will add up, all those marks will add up. And as I mentioned before, sometimes people miss out capitals in their names and things. So that's just your basic punctuation. That's what you should already be able to do. But then we come We're looking here at the level 2 advanced punctuation in terms of commas, apostrophes and inverted commas. You need to demonstrate the correct use of commas, not just in lists, because that's an easy one, but in complex sentences, and also possessive apostrophes, not apostrophes of contraction. So apostrophes of contraction are words like don't, can't, won't. And the examiners aren't interested in your use of those because that's considered a lower level skill. So in italics here, you can see an example of a complex sentence. Although everyone recovered from the accident, the car's engine was badly damaged. Now that's known as a complex sentence because the first part of the sentence, although everyone recovered from the accident, is known as a subordinate clause. And all that means is that that part there can't be read on its own and make sense. You can't have that as a standalone piece that makes sense on its own with no other information. So that's why we use the comma to indicate where that part is finished. A good way to think about that is if you're doing a complex sentence and you're not sure where the comma goes, the comma will always be at the point where you pause in the sentence. So although everyone recovered from the accident, the car's engine was badly damaged. You can hear yourself pausing after accident. You know that's where the comma should go. I would say not every pause needs a comma, and not every comma should fill a pause, but it is a good way to think about it to start off with. Then we've also got the possessive apostrophe in here, car's engine. That's used when you've got two nouns together, such as car and engine, and the second noun, engine, belongs to the first noun, car. The apostrophe goes before the S because it shows us that we're talking about one car. If the apostrophe goes after the F, it shows you're talking about multiple cars. And if you want to know a bit more about punctuation, there is a separate webinar which talks all about punctuation. After you've watched this one, you could go and have a look at that if it's something you're not very confident. So errors could be in using the punctuation wrongly, so doing what we call comma splicing, which is where you join two sentences together using a comma that shouldn't be there. In the punctuation webinar, we will talk about that, but just to give you an example, it would be joining two separate ideas that both make sense on their own with a comma. So it was raining today, we went outside anyway. Both of those parts would make sense on their own. If you joined them with a comma, that would be incorrect. That would be known as comma splicing. Or the other option where you can make errors in punctuation is missing out punctuation you needed to use. So in the sentence we have there about the car's engine, if you'd missed out that apostrophe, then the examiners would note that. So you really need to be able to demonstrate your use of commas and possessive apostrophes. So what I tend to do is once I've finished a piece, I'll always look back and see where I've actually used them already. If I haven't used any apostrophes, I think commas, you should be using those in your complex sentences. But with apostrophes, it's not always as easy. If you haven't used one, maybe think about how you could maybe add an extra sentence or a bit of extra detail that would allow you to get that possessive apostrophe. Here's a few examples of how else you might use apostrophes. I agree with the council's idea because that's quite a nice one to use around the council, because a lot of the texts tend to be about the council. The examiners really like to write about the council. Either you're complaining to the council, or they're asking you for ideas, or you're contacting them for information. So you can always put councils and then some sort of noun that goes with that. Council's proposal, council's email, council's strategy, anything. You can do the same thing with a person. I agree with Sharon's idea because, or on the opposite side, I disagree with Sharon's opinion because. And then you could just use a word rather than a specific name. My friend's opinion is. So if you're writing a letter, you could talk about my neighbour's opinions are. You can use a place name. Burton's town centre is very. The council's plans are. So lots of different ways that you can try and get an apostrophe into a sentence if you haven't got any in already. For commas, you've got a few different options. You can use your comma after your starting word if you have an introductory word. So on the screen here, you can see two examples. However, comma, unfortunately, comma. And if you actually tried to read a sentence that started with either of those words, you would find yourself pausing after you'd said it. And however, I disagree with what you said. And again, we can link that pause with the use of the comma. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to complete the report. Now those are commas where you put them after your introductory word. You've got a few other options. The second box down on the left, you can see that's a pair of commas, and in between those commas you have some additional information. So you can use a pair of commas to show additional information. The service, which was extremely slow, was of poor quality. So the part inside the commas could be taken out and the sentence would still make sense. Same applies to the bottom left. Council, who have not replied to my letter, do not understand the importance of the development. Again, that part in the two commas could be taken out and the whole thing would make sense still. Over on the right, you'll see two examples of using that subordinate clause, like we saw with the although. So if you start a sentence with if or when, you'll find there's a point in that sentence where you will pause. If you enjoy exercise, you will like the new class at Meadowside. When I opened the package, I found it was damaged. So that comma just puts that pause in and shows where the two parts of the sentence are separated. Again, you can see more examples of how to do this on the punctuation. So here are just a few other things you might want to focus on while you're doing your writing exam. So are you making sure that it contains all of the relevant information and ideas? So ask yourself, have I understood the topic? And have I included everything that is asked for in the stimulus text and the question? So as we mentioned before, they'll give you some kind of text, whether it's shorter or longer to read, and then they'll present you with the question. I'd always check a couple of times. Obviously, you'll read it carefully at the start. Then I'd suggest you plan out what you want to say. Then I would start writing. After I've done a couple of paragraphs, I'd just check it again, just to make sure that I'm not getting distracted and going off the tangent. Because if you can lose marks easily by going off topic, misunderstanding what they want, or if your text is so short it doesn't cover everything, then you won't get all the full marks. A couple of specific details to check. Are you actually asked to give any really specific information in that piece? So it might be contact details. Are you supposed to give an address or a phone number or an email address? Or that might be for a letter or asking for a job application. You don't have to give your real contact details because, of course, the examiners don't know who you are. Just make something up if you need to. But is it concise? So what the examiners will be looking for in terms of conciseness is, do your sentences just go on and on and on with no clear end and have loads of ideas all stuffed into one giant sentence? They're also looking for repetition of ideas. I noticed this quite a lot in the level 2 exams. People tend to repeat themselves a bit. And waffling. Don't waffle on. Just because you've written a really long answer doesn't mean it's a better answer than someone else's shorter one. Cover all the points, cover them well, stop. Is it logical? So consider using a structured approach and making a rough plan. I would always say you do this before you start. If you're doing the paper exam, you can do a rough plan and then just put a line through it to top it out. Remember, you absolutely must use paragraphs. They are absolutely essential. Think about the order you're going to talk about your points in before you start. Are you going to do a sort of chronological order of what happened? Have you got some main points? My general suggestion is to do a plan and write down the 5 key things you could talk about. I always say 5 because if you only talk about 3, that's probably still absolutely fine to hit all the marks. So I would always talk about your main 3 first. If you feel you have time or you feel you haven't said enough, you can then talk about a 4, and then you can always bring in a 5th if you need it. If you've planned 5, you've given yourself lots of scope for doing more on the question. So think about that order as you're planning, particularly if you're handwriting your piece, because you don't have the option easily to go back and add things in. You can do so and you can put arrows, but it can get a bit messy. I'd also recommend using some linking phrases that will help the examiners to see that you structured your piece clearly. So I'd use words such as firstly, finally, the next point, secondly. So all those linking phrases. What's good about those is it gives you the opportunity to show off your comma use, as you can see there. After you've used them, they're an introductory word, so you'd use your comma. So get into the habit of trying to have a nice flow through your paragraph. Persuasively. Sometimes you'll need to be persuasive. So you might need to persuade a friend to do some kind of charity event with you, persuade somebody to go somewhere, lend you something, all sorts of things. It can be a little bit hard to write. So I'd always be clear about what the aim of the piece is. So what are you trying to achieve with your persuasiveness? And then I would suggest knowingly using at least 2 persuasive techniques. And those that have done the reading exam will probably have identified some of these techniques while they've done their revision. So repetition, emotive language, reasoned argument, rhetorical questions, and direct address. So direct address is where you use the words you and your in your piece to have a more personal appeal. So that's persuasiveness. Always do try and really be evident about the persuasiveness, really show it off to the examiner. Language is consistently clear and suitable for purpose and audience. So examiners are looking for sentences that just don't quite make sense, poor language choices. For me, that would be a sentence where you read it and you don't quite get it, so you have to read it again, and then possibly a 3rd time. Always think about who the text is for and think about the wording. So if it's for the council, you can use more formal language. If it's supposed to be peers in your workplace or in a college, then you might want to be a little bit more informal. So think about your word choices. Here are just some phrases that people tend to use that can lose marks. So using phrases such as people that. That goes with objects, not with people. It should always be people who. Using informal phrases in a formal text, loads of stuff, and that favourite one I mentioned before, a lot, which really isn't a word and shouldn't be written like that, but I see it a lot. Using what in the middle of a sentence. Something that's quite popular, I think, with people in the maybe 16 to 23 age range, just roughly, using the word what just in the middle of a sentence for no particularly good reason. So I want to complain about the development, what is being built on Main Street. So if you're one of those people that likes the word what, I'd suggest try and limit it to when you're asking a question and put it at the beginning of your question. Otherwise, you probably don't need it. So finally, we'll come on to the general top tips for your writing exam. So always make sure you're using the correct structure for the piece that you're doing. So if you're doing a letter, have you got your addresses and dates in? If you're doing an article, does it have a heading? Really important not to use the wrong structure. A lot of people, they practice letters a lot in their classes. They get in the exam and it's not a letter, but they just do a letter anyway. So do read the question. Always proofread carefully. My proofreading tip is to actually read out loud to yourself. Now I say out loud because it's an exam, so you can't actually read loudly, but I would suggest mouthing the words to yourself. So read every single word you've written to yourself. Because what happens is our brains, as we're reading, we read quickly and our brains fill in words that we anticipate to be there. So if you've missed out a small word or if you've changed it for another similar looking word, when we're reading quickly, our brains will just automatically see that as the word we expect. When you're reading out loud, you actually focus on every single word, and that will give you more opportunity to spot a mistake. Try to get some of that advanced punctuation in that I've mentioned, so your commas, your possessive apostrophes, your inverted commas. Try and include some of those. If you're not all that skilled at using it at the minute, do a bit of practice. Practice writing a few sentences where you can get those commas in. Always read every question twice before you start it to make sure you've understood it, and read it again when you're halfway through and read it again at the end, because that's where a lot of people will lose the marks. And the other thing people do to lose marks is they spend all of their time or most of their time on the first question. They might spend 40-45 minutes on the first one, and they've got to rush the second one, and it's nowhere near as good. So keep a real tight eye on the time. I would suggest if you're getting close to the 30 minutes and you're not really finished, leave a gap, write the ending to the first piece, move on to the second one. If you've got time, go back and fill that gap in, or give yourself an extra 5 minutes at the end to just go back and finish off the first piece. It's much better to stop and then finish a piece completely than it is just to leave it hanging as well. If you wanted to write another paragraph but don't have time, just stop the paragraph you're writing and then always have some kind of concluding sentence or finish before the end. The examiners will be much happier with that than they will just something that stopped completely abruptly with nothing else after it. So keep an eye on the time. Give yourself that checking time at the end so you can use your dictionary. Make sure you've got all those features in, like your headings. Make sure it's appropriate for the audience and the purpose. And check your different sentence types. So have you used some complex ones, some simple ones, some compound? Have you stuck loads of commas in where they shouldn't be? Does it all make sense? If yes, then you've probably passed. You've probably done okay. I say, if you're used to doing a bit of formal writing, it's not too onerous. I think the difficulties people come from is if they've never done any kind of formal writing before, or if they're not English as a first language speaker. So perhaps your first language is Spanish, Polish, Latvian, because then the grammar tends to be the most difficult part for people. They get quite confused on the grammar and they tend to lose a lot of the grammar marks. That doesn't mean that you can't pass, but it means that you've got to be really on top of all the other marks. You can't afford to lose your organisation, your spelling marks, your purpose marks. If you accept that you're going to lose the grammar marks, but focus on the others, then you still have opportunities to pass. So those are my top tips for the writing exam. I'd suggest after this webinar, you would watch the webinars on doing your letters and emails and articles, reports and speeches, which will give you some more specific information on each of those text types and give you some sample questions and example answers. You may also want to watch the webinar on punctuation, as that might help you use some of those apostrophes and commas correctly. So that's it for this webinar. I hope it's been useful. As I say, go and have a look at some of the other ones, and of course go on the Edexcel site, download some of those practice tests, have a go at them, have a go at writing those letters and articles. A bit more difficult using the mark scheme to mark your own work for those. So if you've got someone that perhaps does that within your organisation, you might want to ask them to have a look at your work, or perhaps swap over with another colleague that's doing the same exam and see whether you can mark each other's and maybe spot some things that the first person didn't. It is really difficult to proofread your own work. So good luck in your exams. Hope they all go well.